What is your reaction to this news and this late-day report from STAT?
Well, look, I think the report raised the reasonable questions, but I think the news is what it was, which is the data from Moderna is encouraging. There's now data from multiple different vaccine development programs, both preclinical and some clinical data, suggesting that it's possible to develop vaccine constructs that produce immunogenicity, meaning produce antibodies that could potentially be neutralizing against the virus and could afford some level of protection. But the data is very early. We don't know what the titer levels were for this vaccine, for the antibodies that were produced, so we don't know the magnitude of the antibody production. We don't know whether or not all the antibodies were neutralizing, so that means whether or not they would actually target the virus and eliminate the virus. So there's a lot we don't know, but the data was encouraging, but it was early data, and there's still a lot of work to be done, including finding the right dose of that vaccine that could be taken into later stage trials. And so, I think the STAT article raised all the reasonable questions that were still out there yesterday as well. But I think the totality of the data that we have around different vaccine constructs should give us increasing confidence that at some point in the future, and perhaps in the near future, going into the fall, we should be able to develop experimental vaccines that will deliver some level of immunity against this virus.
Some are asking the question tonight, Dr. Gottlieb, whether this data should have been released at all by Moderna. Now, how would you answer that?
Well, look, I'm not sure why they released the data set the way they did, and I suspect they felt compelled to release it after there was some discussion of the data on Friday, or perhaps of this data. There was some discussion about data from an early trial on Friday at a press conference that was held, and if that was referencing the Moderna data, they may have felt compelled to release this on Monday morning. But perhaps if they, had the opportunity to, they would have waited a little longer until they had data on all of the 45 patients on whether or not they were producing neutralizing antibodies, as well as quantitative data on the level of the antibody production. So they qualified the data to describe the level of the antibody production that they saw in the trial, but they didn't quantify it. And you would have wanted to see the quantity of the antibodies that were being produced, really to have an accurate picture of just how robust the immune response was to this virus. I suspect that they didn't have a complete data set. They said at the time that they disclosed this, they only had data on the neutralizing antibodies on the first 8 patients. So they only had data on whether or not the antibodies were actually targeting and eliminating the virus on 8 of the 45 patients. For the other patients, we know that they developed what we call binding antibodies, antibodies that bound the virus, but we don't know if they eliminate the virus.